In July, the approved new laws by World Rugby came into effect, with the changes meant to enhance safety in the game. These include bans on latching and sanctioning for lower limb clearouts. Also, 2 global trials began. One, the water carrier trial, also known as the Rugby rule, and the break foot rule in scrums, required by hookers to reduce axle loading on the neck. In other contact or collision sports such as Olympic diving, the return to play protocols are non-existent. The International Boxing Association, in their medical handbook, rely on a boxer providing a record of previous concussion to the ringside doctor, who at sanctioned competitions is from the association or the organizing committee. Lacrosse, another collision sport played in a reported 63 countries globally, only finalized their policy on concussion in 2019. For many years, rugby has been asking the hard questions.
Mostly as a consequence of spinal injuries, and we know that the scrum was particularly dangerous, and those who follow the sport quite closely will know that over that period they changed the scrum engagement sequence. That was based on research that was specifically done to support the decision and to try and minimize the likelihood of collapsed scrums with high forces on the necks. Around the world that has been very successful, and so where before there were maybe a dozen players in the world would die from scrum and spinal related injuries, that number is now down to 1 or 2. In South Africa we have BoxMart, which has very effectively managed to bring that risk down. So that was previously the cause, and as I say, fortunately it's worked. And so there are now very few instances of death happening on the field of play, fortunately, and that's a case where for sure 1 is too many, and we have to do everything possible to try and prevent that. Concussions are unlikely to be the cause of those unless it's that so-called second impact syndrome, where a player experiences a head impact, causes a concussion and continues to play. They are potentially very vulnerable, which is why it's so important to identify the concussion when it happens and get that player out of the game. There have been cases around the world where that hasn't happened, and tragically they do end with the death of players, even young, particularly young players. But generally a single concussion is not lethal.
With everything that's around the head injury protocol, I'm referring to the elite game now. So with regards to the head injury, the HIA, the head injury assessment protocol that's in place, all the lessons that we've learned over time, we've been able to implement that into the game to make it safer. So there have been law changes. With the introduction of a temporary replacement law came in, so that now that means that if a player is deemed to have taken a knock to the head that could potentially cause a concussion, that player can be removed and temporarily replaced, while a doctor puts the player through a multimodal tool to assess whether he may or may not have concussion. So that's law changes. Obviously around all of this we realize education is key. So educational tools were developed, and those educational tools are aimed at players, they're aimed at coaches, they're aimed at referees. It's all to make the game safer. Obviously education is critical. The more people know, the more they act responsibly and do the right thing. Then on top of all of that, all the learnings we've got, like we said, law changes, education, and then also we keep trying to improve on those on that head injury assessment tool. And currently right now we have other research projects going on in place. We've got instrumented mouth guards looking at sort of the head impact. We're doing eye tracking, which is looking at another way we can assess for concussion during a game. So there's lots that we've learned, and there's lots that we're doing that we can constantly improve the objectivity of the tests that we use to identify a player who may be concussed while playing the game of rugby.
Yeah, what is enough? I think we don't consider anything being enough. I think it's an ongoing process. I think what we have to do as a collective is to get more people involved. What we've tried to do with getting this online platform is to reach more parties, more people and stakeholders within the game of rugby, and even the spectators can go and have a look at some of the information that's out there, because all our information is freely accessible. What has been shown from a concussion prevention perspective is that the predominant target, the predominant way of intervening is concussion education. Yes, not everybody will necessarily buy into it, but that is something that you will find that will change over time. The more you can get parents educated around how their children should be managed on the field, the more you can get to the medical professionals who are servicing on the side of the fields, being first aiders, maybe to understand concussion a bit better. That would be another loophole which we can try and plug in the future. But education of coaches, education of referees, we've done a lot of that. We've had, as I said, almost 172,000 people gone through training on BoxSmart. And one of the primary points in BoxSmart education is concussion management, concussion identification, its treatment, and how to access the right return to play strategy in order to get those players back to the field safely.
When you look at head injuries in general, sport is a component, but it is the last on the list. So the very serious surgical, neurosurgical type of head trauma, sport is the last cause. But however, having said that, if we go back to my first one on the list, which is concussion, unfortunately sport is the commonest culprit when we talk about concussion.
The changes in the last 10 years, I think, fall into two categories. One is between the lines. It's actually laws of the game that you'll see on television. The second is more policy related, and it's how concussions specifically are managed off the field, things you don't necessarily see but you may know about. So if we talk about the latter group, in 2011, up to 2011, there was no head injury assessment. There was no opportunity for a player with a suspected concussion to come off the field and go and have a screen like you see now. Now we're all familiar with that. A player leaves the field, spectators say, well, he's going for his HIA. They know that in 10 minutes time he may come back. If he passes his tests, if he doesn't pass the test, he's going to stay off. That's only about a decade old, which is surprising to many people. So I think the introduction of that system, the head injury assessments, the diagnosis of concussion, the return to play protocols that were then introduced, they were significant developments in the sport. And I mean, you may say I'm biased because I work in that sport, but I do think rugby has led the way with respect to how it identifies, diagnoses and then manages concussions. The first category I mentioned there is what happens between the lines on the field. And in the last 5 or 6 years, based on research, we identified that the main risk of a concussion was when players' heads shared airspace. It wasn't from going low, it wasn't from heads on knees and heads on hips, it was actually from heads and shoulders hitting one another.
I definitely think the game is safe. We can make improvements. For example, I have gotten myself a scrum cap because my future is very important to me and I know the impact of concussions in the future. So there are precautions that a player can take.
There's a 50% chance because you can't say it's safe because anything can happen on the field, but there's rules and regulations, so it is safe. Yeah, you can say it's safe because the ref will make sure that the person who gets you in trouble or give you a high tackle, they will sort him out immediately.
The game is definitely safe enough with all the rules and regulations that are in place. I feel that SA Rugby has obviously, SARA has obviously gotten the BoxSmart accreditation for the refs and the coaches and the players. So basically, you know that if someone gets a knock to the head, you know not to play, stop play, get a HIA, and then take it from there.
You know those kind of hard, old-fashioned type of players, they refuse to go off. They literally refuse. And I try to explain to the coach that we cannot go by their decision because they are concussed. So even in a court of law, you can't say, but the player said this because his mental function is deranged. But what's interesting is that both of them, within 10 minutes of them restarting the game, they scored very critical goals. And that kind of made me lose the point. Nonetheless, having said that, that was just sheer luck. If a player is concussed, a player should be removed from the field of play. And it's very important for the touchline doctors or whoever or other healthcare workers that are offering emergency medical care to watch very closely because concussion is very subtle.
The primary target and stakeholders are the coaches and the referees. They are the ones who influence how the player behaves in training, how they treat each other, and how they play on match day. So those are the main people that we target. There's also many other platforms via ourselves and also via World Rugby where they target the medical professionals involved in the game.
There's no doubt that rugby players have, over the past, say, almost 30 years, gotten bigger and stronger and faster and more powerful. We've got data on this. We analysed it for these exact discussions, where we've shown that since the '95 World Cup, recall that rugby went professional immediately after that, the mass and the height of players has definitely increased. In the forwards, I think it's about 10%, and in the backs around 11% bigger than they were then. What's interesting is that increase has happened all between '95 and 2011. So it's kind of, they got bigger and bigger and bigger, and since 2011 it has leveled off. So in that respect, when people say they're getting bigger, it's not quite accurate. They got bigger and now they've stayed big.
There's been a lot of work now done by the rugby union, especially on concussion, because like I have said, rugby is the #1 sport when you rank the sport in terms of risk of concussion. And there's a lot of work now that rugby is doing, that the rugby union is doing to support research in sport, mainly to allow us to know what the situation is, because you cannot manage something that you cannot measure. So we need to measure how great is the problem, what is the problem. Then that way we can then come up with a mitigating factors. So there's a lot of work that the rugby people are doing in concussion, even in South Africa.
Our aim is not to change the fibre of the game, as you mentioned, the essence of the game. And the big legal hit and the big safe hit is still welcome. That's very much what we're not saying that's got to go away from the game. But what we've got to do is, and you spoke about medical staff, but it's not just the medical staff's responsibility, it's coaches' responsibility as well, it's referees, it's all of us involved in the game. From a coaching perspective, we need to coach the techniques correctly, and we need to make sure that players are competent in performing those techniques. Referees, we need to apply the laws correctly. If we apply the laws correctly, we remove a lot of risk from this game. And then of course, players who are coached correctly know that the game's going to be ref correctly. Players take responsibility. And if all three of those entities are working correctly, we can really make this game safer, but still have the essence of the game of rugby that we all know. You can still see a big hit. It's a safe big hit.
The changes in the law are achieving a small effect on the field. And what we need is something a little bit more drastic, a little bit more profound. There are currently trials. There's one in Stellenbosch, there's one in England, and there's a trial in France where they've changed the height of the tackle down to the waist. So at the moment, anything above the shoulder is illegal. They've moved it right down to the waist. And that would be a profound change that is aimed at bringing the tackle height lower and protecting the head by avoiding head-to-head collisions. If that works very well, and if the other studies that have kept the height here don't quite work as well, I can see, certainly in the community game, maybe there's a separation between what's done in the community and what's done by elite professional players. I can see a lot of rugby going in that direction, where we try and reduce head contact almost to the maximum, so there's none of it happening.
New knowledge and better understanding is one of the joys of the journey of life. Then, adaptation with new knowledge is needed. In the sport of rugby, it's required to stay ahead in the game.